Kaya yang nunok maman yoga yau calling nicha maya maya wa ngai ingra coming ngai wajak nunga yoga ngai jenening nuna nyining ngai kwapwa yau calling nicha maya maya. Pretty good, eh? Good morning, everybody. My name is Ingrid Cumming. I'm a Wajak Noongar woman and a traditional owner and custodian of this beautiful country here along the Bilia, the Swan River. And it's my absolute honour to be able to do the Welcome to Country this morning on behalf of my ancestors past and present. Because of them, I get to stand here and I get to carry on these fantastic traditions and cultures and connections to this place. So I do it with the greatest honour. So ladies and gentlemen, you may have seen me do it before. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. I like to sing. Apparently I do it not too bad. So what I'm going to do is sing a songline for you, and it comes from a place called Kalamurda here in Perth. Kalamurda is a beautiful place up in the hills. If you say it with an Aussie accent, it sounds a bit like Kalamunda. Any Kalamundians in the room? Not one today. Wow. No, there is. Hello. So Kalamurda or Kalamunda, if you were ever wondering what it means the home fires of ceremony. So it's a very significant place where people from all around would come and talk very important business, culture, law. A lot of marriages and coming together of families happen. So I like to sing this song at events like this because it's very much like what we're doing here today. We're all from different families, different companies, different influences, and we all come together to share the wealth of knowledge that we all hold together for the betterment of our communities. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you the beat by clapping my hands. Hopefully you will join in with me, and I'll give $50 to anyone who can translate. Are you ready? Jenening yeranuna, maman yoga kuminga, nichan yunga puja, kopidan yunga puja, maya maya ngang mutang, maya maya ngang bridia, maya maya ngang kulinga, wanju nichan yunga puja. Woo! Hey. Anyone? $50? No? So the song translates to welcome to beautiful Noongar country, the homelands of our spiritual ancestors, our families and our future. And we ask the good spirits to come look over all of us as we join here today. Ladies and gentlemen, I usually tell a really funny joke about being the physical form of a black Russian because my mum's Russian and my dad's Noongar. But I'm going to leave that today. Ooh, I kind of slipped it in. I just want to take a moment to give a lot of love to the particular person who's speaking today. Because of Ben Wyatt, I got to travel to Israel many years ago and present my first ever published paper at the UN Women Leaders Forum in Israel. I got to sit with world leaders and talk about the Aboriginal community and women and what we were hoping for and aspiring for in the future. Because of that, that was a big part of changing my life, and there's no greater idol to me in my life than our Treasurer. So to you, Uncle Ben, or Brother Ben, we're almost, I think we're the similar age, aren't we? You should call you brother. Thank you for the opportunities that you've given me. Thank you for the inspiration that you give to many of us in the Aboriginal community, and thank you for your incredible leadership here in Western Australia and beyond. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Wanju Nitch Noongar Budja, welcome to beautiful Noongar country, and enjoy your breakfast.
Welcome to this event. Hope you've enjoyed your breakfast. Thank you to Ingrid Cumming from Kart Kurt Wayan, which translates to mind, heart, spirit, for that lovely welcome to country earlier. My name is Mark Beyer. I'm the editor of Business News and I'll be your MC this morning. I'd like to start by welcoming our special guest. The Treasurer Ben Wyatt has a very broad brief, covers many things, but today he's going to be talking particularly about the international trading situation, issues with the US and China, and what the McGowan Government is hoping to do about that. So please join me in welcoming the Treasurer. As Ben makes his way up, I'll also acknowledge our sponsors this morning. Our sponsors are Murdoch University and the Perth US Asia Centre. Thanks also to the Hyatt for supporting this event, and to Kalnegia Family Vineyards for providing the gift for the vote of thanks. If you have questions this morning, you can log on to slido.com and enter your questions there with the event code TREASURE. When you're there on Slido, you can see questions that other people have put up, and if you like them, you can just click on those questions and they'll go to the top of the list. Peter Kennedy will also be coming up after the Treasurer's brief address to handle the Q&A. So on that note, please welcome Ben to the stage for his speech.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Ingrid, where are you? Thank you very much for your welcome to country and your very kind words. I'm not going to sing. You can relax about that. But it's Ingrid has been an extraordinary leader in the Aboriginal community, young leader in the Aboriginal community, and I've been delighted to support her as much as I possibly can and will continue to do so. Can I also acknowledge the Noongar people? We're here actually just across from Matagarup, Harrison Islands, a very significant site for the Noongar people, a very long-term, rich fishing ground. And so the Hyde here is located on the old wetlands that led into the series of islands before they were effectively filled in and became one Harrison Island. Can I also acknowledge a couple of my parliamentary colleagues who are here? Bill Marmion, I know he's here, and Stephen Price, the member for Forestfield. Thank you for coming. Can I thank Business News for putting this event on, and thank you all for coming. It's a large crowd, which I think highlights the fact that world affairs and trade is something now that is no longer a distant issue, but is something that I guess we're all turning our minds to very much on a daily basis, and certainly even overnight with North Korea and America and India and Pakistan. There are events happening almost on a daily basis that will somehow, with a trade-exposed economy like Western Australia's and Australia's, continue to have a significant interest that we have. What I'm going to do, if this works, okay. As Western Australians, the economy and society that you and I live in has, more than any other state, been shaped through its interaction and engagement with other nations. That history stretches back further than you might think. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal people living in the area that we now today call Western Australia traded with other Indigenous nations right across Australia. Sandalwood, red ochre and other materials prized for ceremonies or medicine were transported long distances in a trading tradition of nation-to-nation mutual benefit. Pearl shells, and indeed red ochre, from the seabeds of northern Western Australia have been found in central Queensland and in western New South Wales, carried along ancient trading routes and songlines. Aboriginal people in the northern regions of WA even traded with the Sulawesi people from Indonesia, who would brave open waters to barter for products like sea cucumbers and trochus shells. Since European colonisation, the world has continued to be a hungry consumer of our high-quality agricultural products and commodities, with our economic prosperity depending to a large extent on exports of products like wool, wheat, sandalwood, gold, iron ore, and of course gas. As global markets progressively opened up in the second half of the 20th century, Western Australian exports serviced the needs of millions more people and had an even stronger influence on our standard of living. The development of our export industries has in turn relied on resources from other countries, including imports of manufactured inputs, inbound flows of foreign capital, and most important of all, the migration of people into our state with their labour, their passion and their ideas. Being open to the rest of the world was important to our past, and it is most certainly important to our future. As Western Australians then, we, more than anyone, must take an active and ongoing interest in the state of globalisation and trade, and in particular any emerging threats to the principles and rules-based order that have underpinned our system of trade to date. The global trading environment has the capacity to make us, and it has the capacity to break us. Trade has played a pivotal role in the rise in global living standards over the past 50 years, lifting millions of people out of poverty. The expansion in the size of markets has allowed countries to specialise in what they do relatively best and exploit economies of scale. This has in turn increased incentives for firms to innovate in an effort to discover new products and better ways of doing business. Australia took a particularly unique approach to opening up the global economy. Under Prime Ministers Hawke and Keating, we were one of the first to act on the recognition that a country gains from reducing its own trade barriers. And what is remarkable, and clearly at odds with modern mercantilist sentiment, is that we did so unilaterally and not on the basis of a quid pro quo via trade negotiations. No part of Australia has benefited more from growth in trade than Western Australia. We are more integrated into the global economy than any other state or territory. And as you can see from the first chart here on the left, by some significant margin. Our relatively high trade intensity is, of course, largely driven by commodities, with iron ore playing a dominant role. And as you can see from the second chart, the one on the right, and everyone in this room is no doubt aware, our highest ranked trading partners are from the Asia Pacific, reflecting the growing importance of Asian countries in the location of international trade. This importance is only expected to grow, with the OECD estimating that by 2030, not that far away, the Asian region will account for around 40% of global GDP. Just as important to WA's economic fortunes has been inbound flows of foreign capital. That capital has filled the significant gap between the investment needs of our capital-hungry industries and the supply of domestic savings, without which our key industries could neither develop nor expand. And we have seen this over decades in sectors like iron ore, gold, agriculture and petroleum. We're seeing it today in real time with Chinese and American companies providing critical sources of funding to help expand our lithium sector. Over the past few decades, global trade and investment has continued to grow. The emergence of global value chains has opened up new opportunities for trade in services and foreign direct investment. And countries are continuing to progress trade agreements. Western Australian businesses will continue to benefit from progressive tariff reductions under recent trade agreements, including with Japan, China and South Korea. Further benefits are on the way, with Australia recently signing up to some significant regional agreements, including the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. All of this suggests that WA is well positioned to continue to prosper in the global economy. As you would all know, however, the global trade landscape is shifting. Growth in the volume of world trade over the past few years has slowed considerably. As The Economist magazine has put it, we've entered an era of slowbalisation. A number of factors are contributing to this slowdown, including more cautious lending by banks and the maturing of developing countries' own supply chains. Increasing protectionism is also no doubt playing a role. As this second chart shows, since the global financial crisis, G20 countries have been steadily increasing the number of policy measures that limit trade. Reflecting a growing distrust in globalisation, international trade policy is increasingly being determined by the tactics of populism. However, of all the developments in the global trading environment, the one that is of most interest to Western Australia is the current trade dispute between the United States and China. Trade was a key plank of the current US president's election campaign and has remained a priority, as we've seen. One of the president's main concerns has been his country's bilateral trade deficit with China, worth around $375 billion in 2017. And to put that into some perspective there, as the chart on the left shows, the next largest US trade deficit is $71 billion with Mexico, which is the president's other main trade target. When it comes to Australia, the US runs a $14 billion trade surplus. So no surprise then that we are not a central target of current US trade measures. Although it is worth noting that a Kemerton-based silicon manufacturer was caught up in the recent US administration's attempt to protect a local industry. The manufacturer was only saved from a 51% tariff when the independent US International Trade Commission intervened late and rejected the need for that protectionism. The main weapon of choice in the trade dispute is tariffs. To date, the US has imposed a 25% tariff on Chinese goods worth around $50 billion and a 10% tariff on a further $200 billion worth of goods. Tariffs were initially targeted at high technology industrial goods, but have expanded into other areas, including consumer products. China has in turn responded, as these things tend to progress, with 25% tariffs on US imports worth around $50 billion. The Chinese tariffs are mostly targeted at agricultural goods, some manufactured goods, steel and aluminium scrap. And China has also placed a 5 to 10% tariff on an additional $60 billion of US products, including a 10% tariff on LNG. The US had threatened to increase the tariff rate on $200 billion worth of goods on the 1st of March, but just this week, the timing for this was delayed indefinitely, given reported progress in trade negotiations between the two countries, but certainly very positive rhetoric change. Both sides, however, have threatened to apply tariffs to around another $275 billion US dollars worth of trade, and around $255 billion of which is the remaining value of US imports from China, with the rest of the remaining value of Chinese imports from the US. And you can see there, the chart on the right, the impact of the threatened tariffs we're likely to have compared to what the current tariffs in place is in the current round of dispute. So it is certainly a relief to all that there has been some progress in that relationship. In the middle of 2018, I met with US and European investors to promote WA's borrowing program. In these meetings, a number of investors raised the US-China trade dispute, and in particular wanted to know how the potential impacts on Western Australia's economy and, of course, our budget. This was a matter that obviously we had some very deep conversations with Treasury about, because, of course, China demand effectively underpins about 25% of the Western Australian economic output. And when I returned to Australia, I requested Treasury to prepare more detailed modelling of the potential impacts on WA. And I'll go through, in summary, the three scenarios they modelled. The details of that document will go up on the Treasury website this morning for those who want to go and read through it in more detail. Clearly, though, nothing can be predicted with certainty on this issue. The current dispute could play out in a number of ways, with the impacts on WA ultimately depending on the extent to which protectionist measures escalate in the US, China and elsewhere, and how exchange rate, financial markets and the global economy responds. To illustrate some of the ways in which events could impact WA, Treasury modelled three scenarios relating to different global responses to the trade dispute. And I want to make clear here, I don't want anyone to be too alarmed yet, this is effectively movements from the baseline. This isn't suggesting declines in investment. This is a movement from the baseline. The baseline is the mid-year review assumptions around consumption, investment, exports, imports, and of course, GSP. So don't be alarmed by some of the numbers. They're not. They're a movement from a particular base. The first scenario, the one up on here now, assumes steady global growth on the back of modest growth in US interest rates and moderate policy stimulus in China. These factors maintain demand for our commodities, which, in combination with the reduction in the Australian exchange rate, increases our export income. Under this scenario, the revenue impact on the WA budget is around $900 million higher over the forward estimates. So just by way of comparison, we're currently spending each budget around in the low $30 billion a year. It's about $900 million higher over a 4-year period. Impacts on the economy are mixed. Investment declines over the period as businesses are assumed to be more cautious, but this is offset somewhat by an increase in exports as business take advantage of greater competitiveness from the lower exchange rate. The net impact of all of this is some modest declines in GSP relative to the baseline late in the forward estimates period. Catch up, I'm sure. So there we go. Scenario 2. So the second scenario assumes China introduces similar policy stimulus to the one it enacted in 2012, which involved easing monetary policy and increasing infrastructure spending. Based on past experience, it was assumed any stimulus would result in the composition of Chinese growth being weighted towards construction activity and therefore demand for raw materials like iron ore, copper and nickel. The stimulus initially boosts WA growth through higher iron ore prices and export income. However, this is then followed inevitably by a period of weakness, reflecting the fact that the Chinese stimulus simply pulls forward construction from future years. The net impact is there is a boost to revenue in the short term, as you can see on the first line, and a drop in the medium term, with the net impact over that 4-year period on the WA budget being negligible. These same dynamics are reflected in the results for the economy. In the short term, the Chinese stimulus encourages investment in our resources sector, driving up wages and household consumption. These positive impacts are offset later in the forward estimates period, with higher wages reducing our competitiveness with other states and an increase in imports reducing our international competitiveness. The third scenario assumes stimulus fails to prevent problems in China's economy, culminating in the disruption of the East Asian manufacturing value chain. This occurs at a time of significant global uncertainty and rising US interest rates. The combination of these factors drives capital from East Asian developing countries, forcing currencies down and interest rates up. Growth slows throughout Asia, reducing commodity prices. The net impact of the various moving parts on the budget over the forward estimates is to reduce revenue by an estimated $2.3 billion over that period. There are also, unsurprisingly, negative impacts on the economy. Investment declines between 7 to 12% each year, which flows through to lower wages and consumption. These impacts are partly offset by depreciation in the exchange rate, increasing the competitiveness of exporters, increasing international exports by around 0.5%. The net impact is that gross state product is around 1 to 2% lower each year. That is not a decline in the GSP, but a decline in from the current assumptions that we have in our mid-year review. So clearly, when you see here, and these are just three scenarios, there are indeed a broad range of potential impacts. I want to make some other observations. Setting aside the specifics of the modelling, in its paper, Treasury makes a number of observations that suggest the financial and economic impacts on WA could be limited if the dispute does not escalate significantly. First, the tariff increases are still relatively small scale. The US is a $20 trillion economy, China around $12 trillion. At this stage, the total value of the tariffs equate to about $70 billion, or around 0.2% of the combined US-China GDP. Second, the evidence suggests the Chinese economy is so far holding up well, with the latest official data showing the Chinese economy grew 6.4% in 2018. In part, this reflects the growing importance of domestic demand for fueling China's economic activity. And it is also worth noting that Chinese exports are still growing, albeit at a slower rate than recent peaks. However, what I'd find most useful for gauging China's economic activity from a WA standpoint is Treasury's proxy for activity in China's commodity-intensive secondary sectors, shown in the first chart there, the one on the left. This indicator combines trends in electricity generation, rail freight turnover, ocean freight, and production of construction materials. Trends in this indicator are very, very closely correlated to the prices of WA's commodities. And as you can see, it is holding up well indeed. Electricity generation last calendar year was running at about 7.2% growth and rail freight at about 7.9% growth. Finally, our most significant export commodity, iron ore, is to some extent shielded from the current dispute, and this is the graph on the right. China's export to the US embodies only a relatively small amount of steel, around 10 million tonnes, which in turn equates to around about 15 million tonnes of iron ore. And to put that into perspective, annual iron ore exports from WA are over 800 million tonnes. So Treasury's analysis of the issues provides some level of comfort. Treasury will continue to obviously closely monitor the situation from a WA perspective, including through regular updates to its secondary sector index. I should also note that Treasury's observations are consistent with a picture that I took away from China recently, and it was apparent to me that after meeting with organisations like the National Development and Reform Commission and Baowu Steel, that China's commitment to low emissions growth would see demand for WA commodities like LNG and high-grade iron ore continue to remain strong into the future. It was also apparent that China remains deeply committed to continue to grow its electric vehicle market, requiring significant amount of commodities like lithium, nickel and cobalt, which, as we all know, found here in Western Australia. Nonetheless, and consistent with research from the Productivity Commission and others, there is a small risk of deeper impacts in the budget and economy. We know from the experience of the 1930s that tit-for-tat type trade wars do have the capacity to have significant global consequences, in particular for those trade-exposed economies like our own. And of course, the US-China dispute is not the only current global event that the government is closely monitoring. Germany, for example, barely escaped a technical recession in the fourth quarter of last year, and we all know about the uncertainties involved with the current Brexit debate. The tragic tailings dams collapse in Brazil, which drove the iron ore price beyond $90 just a few weeks ago, illustrates how unexpected events in other parts of the world can impact us at home. Importantly, the government is committed in cases like these to not making the same mistakes we made previously, and that was to assume that positive economic shocks will continue long into the future. And so as a result, coming into this budget, the increase in iron ore at the time we're setting the iron ore price for the upcoming budget, and what we assume that does over the forward estimates period, we'll probably have to tweak the methodology around that to ensure we don't lock in what is clearly a short-term supply shock, which is having an inflationary impact on the price. We do that, we get ourselves in all sorts of strife when inevitably the price comes back down. And it's important to recognise that this period of our history is not unique. Global uncertainty is not unique and global risks are not unique, it's just how we manage them. Clearly the WA government has no power to directly influence the current trade dispute or other global risks, but we can ensure our economy is strong and resilient as it can be. And to this end, we are doubling down on the reforms we are already progressing in the budget and economy. First, from a budget perspective, seeking to pay off as much debt as possible is critical. Most sensible economists agree there can be a role for timely, targeted, value-enhancing fiscal stimulus in response to significant economic shocks, especially in an environment where monetary policy has little room to move, a situation we find ourselves in today. And clearly, the stronger our financial position, the more capacity we have to absorb and respond to shocks. This is another reason why our determination to return the budget to a position of strength, running reasonably large surpluses, as well as prudent measures like the debt reduction account, are so important. And indeed, just last week, the Governor of the Reserve Bank made a similar comments in respect of the lead up to the current federal election. Secondly, as a state, we will continue to engage directly with other countries. As I've already outlined, we rely on foreign capital too much not to do so. I've seen firsthand the positive impact that direct engagement can have. In China late last year, I was able to ease concerns from investors, a range of investors, around developments in the Eastern Australian gas market. In that case, by emphasising that the WA domestic market is physically separate and very stable. And it is, of course, important that we continue to engage with other emerging and growing economies in our region, like India, Vietnam and Indonesia. Third, in an increasingly globalised world, it is important that we equip our workers so they can meet the challenges of the global economy. And to this end, the government has announced details around WA's first ever STEM strategy. In our vet sector, we are encouraging our TAFEs to work closer with industry. Indeed, Rio Tinto and South Metro TAFE, for example, have recently jointly developed a training program to prepare workers for industry innovation and automation. This program is the first of its kind in Australia. Fourth, we are seeking to diversify the economy through targeted investments in tourism, education and agriculture. We have implemented a number of quick-fire regulatory mapping projects in the areas of ecotourism and aquaculture, which identified practical reforms aimed at reducing unnecessary regulatory burden. And more broadly, we are seeking to increase the economy's overall economic competitiveness with initiatives like Infrastructure WA and Streamline WA. We, as if WA is the only government in Australia explicitly committed to developing and implementing a microeconomic reform agenda, under which we are looking to progress reforms in areas like rail access regulation and licensing arrangements. While the federal government cannot be expected to have any significant influence on the current trade dispute, it nonetheless has an important role in ensuring a trade and investment environment in which our state can prosper. What do we want to see from them? Firstly, I'm nearly done, PK, more transparency in the development of free trade agreements. Continued support for trade relies on the community seeing that gains are indeed shared and that there is support for those negatively affected. In this context, past aspects of trade policy have appeared to work against WA's interests. Our country's previously high tariffs, designed to protect eastern state industries, drove the exchange rate much higher than it would otherwise have been, and as a net exporter, this came as a considerable expense, of course, to WA. Second, and this is something that I've picked up almost in every country in which we have an agreement, the federal government can do more to ensure that businesses can capitalise on free trade agreements, including through better education. When I meet with WA exporters, including expats in China, they often identify a lack of information on export markets and trade agreements as impediments to growing their export businesses. So it's therefore not enough for the federal government to simply secure those trade agreements. They need to go further and ensure that those firms are likely to benefit from an agreement, and they understand the substantive implications of the agreement, and so we can get the most out of it. Finally, in the event of a global rise in protection, there will be pressure on the Australian government to follow suit and lift its own trade barriers. Given the important influence of international trade and investment on WA's economic fortunes, the Australian government and future Australian government should continue expanding trade opportunities for the good of the country and Western Australia in particular. Finally, to conclude, there are reasons to be optimistic that Western Australia's economy and our broader society will continue to prosper in the global economy. Notwithstanding the recent rise in protectionist sentiment, the longer-term trend is towards lower trade barriers. Tariff reductions in a suite of recently negotiated trade agreements with Japan, China and South Korea are still being progressively rolled out. The OECD and UN also report that the overall direction of foreign investment policy measures remains oriented towards further liberalisation. For an economy like WA, that is good news. And of course, in WA, we are better positioned than nearly any other Australian or indeed any Western capital city to capitalise on the remarkable growth in the Asia Pacific. This chart shows the global economy's centre of gravity, estimated by calculating a weighted average of each of the world's major population centres. As you can see, the centre of the global economy is shifting towards Western Australia and its 5 major trading partners. This, combined with a trend towards shorter supply chains and deeper economic links within regional blocks, put us in an enviable position. And closer to home, it's been well documented that the WA economy is recovering. In the last financial year, the domestic economy grew for the first time in 5 years. Business investment increased in 17-18 after going backwards for 4 years, with annual growth in machinery and equipment investment recently at its highest rate since 2012. The all-important measure of business confidence is at its highest level in 6 years. But ultimately, remaining diligent and continuing to progress important economic reforms will continue to ensure that the global economy continues to make us rather than break us. If we continue to meet the challenges of today's world, there is no reason why we cannot continue on our current path towards a modern and thriving economy. Thank you.
That's right. Thanks very much, Treasurer. A most interesting analysis of what is obviously going to be a challenging period. Now, I know you're on a tight schedule, but can we crib a couple of extra minutes for the Q&A session? That's terrific. Absolutely. Right. Look, first up, the 3 scenarios that you outlined, or the Treasury outlined, of the China situation, which one do you think is the most likely?
Well, I've been very encouraged by recent developments, I must admit, between China and the US, because ultimately I still expect sense to prevail. And the reason I do that, I still expect that, is because it doesn't actually, further ratcheting up, the third scenario, the worst case scenario, doesn't help either China or the United States. So I'm expecting now, I'm more positive with the outlook, that sense around tariffs will hopefully prevail. It's just simply because there's no economic interest in either country to continue going the way they are.
Because of our reliance on China as our major trading partner, our major exporting sort of market, the recent stories about coal from New South Wales and Queensland and coal being held up at Chinese ports are concerning, of course. What's the possibility that iron ore could get caught up in that?
Yeah, well, it was very concerning in coal, and I think it highlighted a couple of things. Highlighted the importance of ensuring that we continue to have strong personal relations between China and Australia. We saw for a period of time now, I think it's changed now, it appears to have changed now, where it was very difficult for federal ministers to travel to China, which meant when things like what happened with coal, conspiracy theories ran wild, and everyone was uncertain what was driving it, and that had an impact on the Australian dollar.
But those difficulties involving federal ministers, and I think Julie Bishop's name was mentioned as not being invited as foreign minister, that hasn't applied to you or the Premier?
No, there's been no trouble in state ministers getting visas to travel to China, which is, I think, emphasises the fact that Western Australia does have a very good personal relation with organisations and people in China. The other issue, of course, is from memory, China imports around 17% of the coal that it needs, but of course imports around about 90% of the iron ore that it needs. And in light of what's happened with Vale, I'm not expecting a similar thing with iron ore. In fact, we've got to the point where there's effectively a shortage of iron ore.
Now, the US-China trade conflict is one thing. What about China and Australia and, say, Huawei and the fact that the 5G network was locked out of that, but also its contract with our Transport Department here came into focus. What's happening there?
Yeah, well, certainly as a state government, you're very reliant on your national bodies, your security bodies, and I'd fully expect, regardless of a Labor or Liberal Commonwealth government, that they will continue to act and advise state governments in the national interest. No country in the globe should be surprised by that. The Huawei contract with Transport, we engaged with our security organisations around that, and they expressed comfort. So that's what we did and will continue to do. I mean, that is still obviously playing out, certainly in the United States, but that's not yet having any impact on Huawei's ability to deliver under that contract.
So that local contract with the Department of Transport, that's signed, sealed and being delivered and not subject to change?
No, not at this point, because there's no indication that they can't deliver on that contract. But it also highlights, and I think this is the issue around what we saw with coal and other areas, is that we are dealing with a very different government in China. It's not the same as ours, and we have to understand that. But we also have to be careful with our rhetoric as well, because ultimately getting an insight into transparency around decision making isn't as easy as it is in Western Australia or Australia, and that's why the Premier and me and others have been very, very determined to ensure that the relationship that we have with China continues to be, hopefully on a personal level as well, but continues to be as two governments continues to be strong, because you do need access to information and understanding of decision making.
Treasurer, what are the prospects for the emerging lithium market? Iron ore, LNG, big, lithium, new. The potential there for exports, obviously, but what about value adding as well?
Yeah. Well, the potential is huge. I mean, it's been an amazing tour. I'm sorry if there's any lithium producers here, but the overnight success that you've all spent decades on, it's amazing to watch. And the investment coming into Western Australia, I mean, it's all, effectively all the lithium's now going up into China, but the purpose of our pitch to the Commonwealth to become the centre for excellence, if you like, in lithium is about how far up the value chain can we move. That's the purpose of the Premier's group. It's because ultimately we need to understand there'll be a point where we need to understand how far up can we compete on the global supply chain with value adding. And I think we can go a lot further up than we have historically done in Western Australia with other commodities.
Well, I mean, it's the great West Australian dream, isn't it? To value add our natural resources. I mean, it started with Sir Charles Court and it's been frustrated all the way along. Your government really has the challenge to deliver on this with lithium.
That's right. And because it's obviously being motivated by the construction of batteries. And so it's not, we can do more with lithium than simply dig it up and ship it off. We can value add, and we know that we can value add already, and we are value adding already. It's how far up the chain we can go in, obviously we're a higher wage modern economy, so there'll be a point where the competition hits a level that we can't compete, but I think we can actually get a fair way up than we are in iron ore or almost any commodity that we're exporting.
How far is the government prepared to work with industry to get that value adding going?
Incredibly far, yeah. So we think, and I'm hoping, I notice the Prime Minister's coming over here soon, that he might be announcing the successful recipient of the lithium CRC. I mean, I can't see any other state having really the option to win that other than Western Australia. We're the lithium state.
And what would that mean? What would that mean locally if that was the case?
Oh, well, that will certainly mean government is willing to do whatever it takes, Peter, to ensure that we get much better out value for a commodity that is new. Again, apologies to the lithium producers here. That is effectively new and demand is so high. In fact, the demand for lithium is probably going to be compromised or at least assuaged to a certain extent by the capacity to bring on other minerals that also go into batteries.
Fingers crossed. A question from the floor, and Edward has asked the question, most of your impact scenarios regarding the Treasury and the China incident show a downward pressure on employment. How will you deliver 150,000 new jobs in 5 years in this context? Makes it harder.
Yeah, well, the focus, hence the focus on microeconomic reform, infrastructure WA, setting out a plan for infrastructure delivery, so that government's all about creating an environment that the private sector can invest and feel comfortable to invest. And that's the point. We're the last state, I think, to come to an infrastructure plan. That is the focus of infrastructure WA. It does require ongoing economic growth, and that's what I'm focused on, because it won't be me as employing public servants that are going to create those jobs. It's the people in this room that are going to create those jobs. We're at about 32,000 already since the election. We'll continue to focus on that. But setting a specific target, Peter, as you know, is risky for a government, and we've set a range of specific targets. But I think it's a good thing to do, because it focuses the mind on government as a body as opposed to individually.
In 2024, watch out. Watch out for people wanting to check whether those 150,000...
No doubt, Peter, that anything we haven't met, I'll be getting, gently encouraging media articles about.
A question from Anonymous. What should businesses, regarding the China position, what should businesses in WA be doing to ensure they capitalise on opportunities or defend against challenges?
This is the points I made around free trade agreements. The big businesses know what to do with free trade agreements. They've got the capacity to educate themselves and then to move into those markets in whether it be China or whoever we've got a free trade agreement with. For the SMEs, it's a much more difficult task, because a free trade agreement is done at the Commonwealth level and then kind of stops. And so this is what we're trying to get our head around within Treasury, and certainly with our small business agencies. How do we translate those benefits to SMEs who don't have armies of people or the budgets to employ consultants to help them with it? So I suspect for businesses, and I'm assuming perhaps that SME base, being very specific with the market that you're looking at, because everybody looks at India and China, billions, and we all want a piece of it, but being very specific with the market you're looking at. And to be frank, like the government, ensuring your balance sheet is as strong as it can be, because whilst I'm positive, preparing for uncertainty means that you need to be able to have the capacity to react.
And Treasurer, one other question from the floor. With regard to recent events, Anonymous asks, with regard to recent events, for example, positive signs on the US-China trade negotiations, does that make the global economic outlook look more benign than in recent months?
Well, I was very encouraged by the recent China-US deferral of those tariffs, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. And it highlights to me, I think, that you might still get the rhetoric, but underneath you're still going to get hopefully sort of more sensible decision making, because regardless of the rhetoric, we know what, particularly you saw the leap up in tariffs that were proposed. The President would know, be getting advice on what that's likely to do to his own support base in the United States and the US economy. That has been going very, very well, driven by obviously tax cuts at the moment. Is it more benign? I don't think I'd ever describe what's going on globally at the moment as benign, but certainly it's more positive than it was a month ago, I think.
And last question, and this is a great opportunity to have the Treasurer here. Your third budget in May, Treasurer, what sort of budget can we expect? Will there be sort of revenue-raising measures as in budgets 1 and 2?
18-19 was described as boring, Peter. If I can get away with another one, I would be delighted. Treasurers love boring budgets, ministers love exciting budgets. I think now, third of a 4-year term, Peter, I think the task of budget repair will continue. We have to keep expense growth still where we are. And the reason expense growth is what we focus on is when there is a benefit on the revenue side, you're actually in a position to take advantage of it. And we are seeing a short-term revenue increase this financial year with the iron ore price. But 3 weeks ago it was over $90, it's now down to 83. You can't lock that in across the next 3 years and assume that revenue is going to stay at what is at an artificially high rate. So back to surplus position next financial year, and that's when you'll start seeing the debt trajectory go the way we want it to go, and the budget will be around that as well. And I suspect, Peter, if the federal election's on the 11th of March, bearing in mind the budget's 9th of March, there may not be that much excitement around it.
All right, but with regard...
May, not March, May. I just saw the Treasury officials have kittens over there.
I thought you might have had some inside information.
May, oh my God.
All right, Treasurer, look, thank you very much for that little bit of insight, and the analysis of the China position, most informative. Would you please thank the Treasurer for his coverage this morning?
Thanks, PK.
Say this, thank you. And I'd now like to call on Professor Gordon Flake, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Perth US Asia Centre, to move the vote of thanks. Professor Flake.
Thank you. I want to start by joining with the Treasurer and others in expressing particular thanks to Ingrid Cumming for that invigorating welcome to country. I think it's appropriate for a breakfast meeting that we start out clapping and fully awake. And although I will offer some consolation to the Treasurer, if he was troubled by the transition from Brother Ben to Uncle Ben, the transition to Grandpa Ben is harder still, so as we're going forward. There is a Chinese proverb, which I learned translated into Korean, which says, "Gongja peso munja sujima," which literally means, do not try to write literature in front of Confucius. You know, and I came up here thinking, you know, head of the Perth US Asia Centre, I might have some insights to offer in terms of developments in China, the trade in the region, et cetera. And we've really been treated to a tour de force by the Treasurer, who kind of lays out a lot of the issues. And so it'd be kind of remiss of me to try to add something to what the Treasurer said. But let me start by saying it is a particular honor to work with Business News and to support them in this breakfast. We appreciate the Treasurer and his remarks. Delighted to work with the Murdoch University as well, one of the other co-sponsors for this morning, and their Asia Research Center. The Perth US Asia Center was founded 6 years ago based on two fundamental presumptions. Number one was that there was a critical mass of global caliber strategic thinkers in Western Australia that would warrant a foreign policy think tank. Normally, our types of organization exist only in national capitals. And I think we saw in the Treasurer's speech this morning and in the discussion that followed, a remarkable degree of sophistication around these issues that is driven by our relative exposure to international affairs. And so the fact that we focus heavily on geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geostrategic developments is clear. The second presumption behind our creation was that perspectives here in WA were sufficiently different from those that you would get over in the East Coast that, again, it would warrant a unique voice here in Western Australia. And again, I think we saw that clearly today. If there was one thing I might add to what I thought were very comprehensive remarks, which I agree with fully, would be to step back and put them in a slightly larger perspective. And that is that what struck me, and I think it probably struck all of you as well, is that wonderful map that showed the shifting economic center of gravity globally, moving increasingly towards Asia and in process towards Western Australia. If you took that same map but didn't look at it globally, but you looked at the shifting economic center of gravity within Asia, you would have something very similar. When I started my professional career 30 years ago, the economic center of gravity was clearly in Northeast Asia, primarily Japan, then Korea, Taiwan, et cetera. Over the last 25 years, the defining development of that era, and again, the Treasurer has addressed it very directly, has been the shifting economic center of gravity as China has grown and has moved southwest. But the next phase is equally important to Western Australia. And that is obviously what happens in the next 25 years as ASEAN continues to grow. Indonesia is forecast now for the last 10 years to be the 5th largest economy in the world, if not the 4th largest economy in the world by 2050. And if you use purchasing power of parity, maybe by 2030. Obviously, ASEAN as a whole, Vietnam, India. And what that means is that wonderful map that the Treasurer showed us can be put together with a map of the economic center of gravity in Asia. And again, both of them, conveniently, end up moving closer and closer to Western Australia. So in that regard, it's really enheartening to have a Treasurer at the helm who understands these trends, understands what the trends mean for our state, what they mean for industry, and what they mean for the country, given the unique perspectives that we have in Western Australia. So let me again join with the host in acknowledging and thanking our speaker, the Honourable Ben Wyatt, Treasurer, Minister for Finance, Aboriginal Affairs and Lands. And I will note with one final comment that the hashtag that was used to ask questions, I thought it was a mistake. It said hashtag Treasurer. And I thought it should have said Treasurer. But clearly, we have a treasure here in Western Australia. And please join me in thanking for that process.
Thanks so much. Very kind of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ben. We can head off.
Actually, I forgot the most important part.
Thank you very much.
Wine from Warren.
Thank you.
Another round of applause, please, for the Treasurer. And thanks also to Gordon and the Perth US Asia Centre for the vote of thanks, and to PK for hosting the Q&A session there. Hope you've all enjoyed the breakfast this morning. I'll wind up by thanking our sponsors, Murdoch University and the Perth US Asia Centre. These events aren't possible without support from sponsors. Also to the Hyatt Hotel and to Calnegia Family Vineyards. Briefly, I'll point out a couple of events coming up from business news. Our next Success and Leadership breakfast will be with Barry Fitzgerald, Chief Executive of Roy Hill Holdings, a fast-growing iron ore business with very strong links into Asia, not just China. Barry will be joining us on the 28th of March. And then we've got David Singleton, Chief Executive of Austral, on the 30th of May. Both of those events will be here at the Hyatt. Both will provide lots of interesting insights, and tickets are now on sale. And if you'd like more information for these events, please get in touch with us. And now it's time for the door prize. This is a door prize from the Hyatt, so if you're looking forward to a night here and something tasty to eat, someone can look forward to that. Richard Lipscomb from Proteomics International. Well done, Richard. You can come and see Rosemary. Thanks very much for coming, everybody. Hope you have a very good day. Good morning.